The smell of charcoal and grilled meat filled the afternoon air as I stood there, sauce-stained apron still tied around my waist, watching my neighbor's face drain of all color. Behind me, 12 soldiers in pristine dress blues had just stepped through the backyard gate, their boots moving in perfect synchronization across the freshly cut grass. The same people who had spent the last 3 hours making jokes about my fake military stories suddenly couldn't find their voices. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The whole thing started 3 weeks earlier when I moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood Heights, just outside Fort Richardson. After 8 years of active duty and countless deployments, I was finally ready to settle down somewhere that felt normal. The 2-story colonial house with its white picket fence and mature oak trees seemed like the perfect place to start over. My name is Captain Sarah Mitchell, though nobody in the neighborhood knew that yet. I'd made a conscious decision to keep my military background private. After years of people either treating me differently once they found out I was in the Army, or worse, questioning whether women belonged in combat roles, I wanted to just be another neighbor. Just Sarah who worked in logistics? Which wasn't technically a lie. The moving truck had barely pulled away when my next-door neighbor, Brad Thompson, came strutting over with a beer in hand, and that particular brand of confidence that comes from never having your worldview challenged. He was the type who wore cargo shorts year-round and had opinions about everything from lawn care to foreign policy. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, giving my boxes a once-over. "Hope you're not one of those career women who never has time for community stuff. We've got a pretty tight group here." I forced a smile. I'm sure I'll fit right in. Over the next few days, I met the rest of the core group. There was Jennifer Walsh, Brad's wife, who seemed nice enough but had a habit of making backhanded comments disguised as compliments. Mike Rodriguez lived across the street and considered himself the neighborhood's unofficial historian, always ready to lecture anyone about how things used to be done. Then there was Carol Stevens, an older woman who'd lived on the block for 30 years and appointed herself the keeper of all social norms. The annual Memorial Day barbecue was apparently the neighborhood's biggest event. Brad knocked on my door the Thursday before, his chest puffed out with self-importance. "Hope you can make it to our little shindig on Monday," he said. "Fair warning, though, we get pretty patriotic around here. Lots of respect for our military and all that. Not like those Hollywood types who just pretend to support the troops." "Sounds great," I replied, biting back the urge to tell him about the 3 bronze stars collecting dust in my closet. Monday arrived with perfect barbecue weather, sunny skies, and a gentle breeze. I showed up at Brad's backyard, carrying a homemade potato salad and wearing a simple sundress. The party was already in full swing, with about 20 neighbors scattered around the deck and lawn. Everything started pleasantly enough. I helped Jennifer set up the condiment table, chatted with Carol about her garden, and even laughed at Mike's terrible dad jokes. But then the conversation shifted, as it inevitably does at gatherings like this, to politics and current events. "You know what really gets me," Brad announced loudly, flipping burgers with unnecessary aggression, "is all these people claiming to be veterans when they never saw real action. Stolen valor, they call it, makes me sick." A few people nodded in agreement. I kept quiet, focusing on arranging napkins. "Oh, don't get me started on that," Jennifer chimed in. "And the worst part is when women claim they were in combat. Like, come on. We all know they just sat behind desks filing paperwork." My hands stilled on the napkin dispenser. The rational part of my brain knew I should let it go. But 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq had taught me that sometimes silence is mistaken for agreement. "Actually," I said carefully, "women have been serving in combat roles for years now. Many have made incredible sacrifices." Brad laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Sure, maybe they were technically in country, but let's be real about what that means. It's not like they were kicking down doors or anything." The group's attention had shifted to our conversation now. I could feel their eyes on me, measuring my response. "Some of them were," I said quietly. "Come on, Sarah," Mike jumped in, his voice dripping with condescension. "I know you mean well, but you don't really understand how military operations work. It's not like the movies. Real combat is brutal, physical work. Women just aren't built for it. And that's not being sexist, Carol added quickly, as if that disclaimer somehow made her next words acceptable. It's just biology. Men are natural warriors. Women are nurturers. That's how God designed us. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. I think you might be surprised by what women in the military are capable of. Oh, please, Jennifer scoffed. What would you know about it? You work in logistics, right? Pushing papers around an office? The irony wasn't lost on me. Technically, I did work in logistics now, coordinating supply chains and personnel movements for an entire battalion. But that came after years of leading convoys through IED-laden roads and coordinating air support for ground operations. I know enough, I said simply. Brad's laughter was louder this time, more performative. He was playing to his audience now, and they were eating it up. No offense, Sarah, but you're exactly the type who falls for all that feminist propaganda. Next, you'll be telling us that women can be Navy SEALs or something ridiculous like that. Why would that be ridiculous? The question slipped out before I could stop it. The entire group went quiet for a moment, then erupted in laughter. Not good-natured chuckling, but the kind of mean-spirited laughter that's designed to put someone in their place. Oh, honey, Carol said, her voice syrupy with fake sweetness. You're adorable, but there's a difference between watching action movies and understanding real warfare. Right, Mike added, warming to the theme. I mean, I'm not saying women can't contribute to the military. They make great nurses and cooks and whatnot. But actual fighting? Come on. I felt my jaw clench. In my mind, I could hear the sound of incoming mortars, could smell the dust and smoke of Kandahar province. I remembered the weight of full battle gear in 120-degree heat. The split-second decisions that meant the difference between bringing everyone home or writing letters to their families. You know what your problem is, Sarah? Brad continued, clearly on a roll now. You believe everything you see on social media. All those fake stories about women heroes. It's all just PC nonsense designed to make people feel good. Fake stories? I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. Oh, absolutely, Jennifer jumped in. Like all those ridiculous tales about women single-handedly saving their units or taking out enemy positions. Pure fantasy. The real military doesn't work that way. I thought about Lieutenant Rachel Torres, who'd thrown herself on a grenade to save her squad in Fallujah. About Sergeant Maria Santos, who'd held off an enemy assault for 6 hours while calling in air support for her wounded team. About the Purple Heart in my jewelry box that I'd earned the day an IED flipped our convoy vehicle and I'd dragged 3 unconscious soldiers to safety while taking sniper fire. You seem pretty certain about that, I managed to say. Well, yeah, Brad said, puffing out his chest. I mean, I would have enlisted myself, but I had flat feet. Medical disqualification. But I've got buddies who served, and they tell me the real stories, not the propaganda version. The conversation continued to spiral, each comment more dismissive than the last. They talked about women as if we were delicate flowers who needed protection from the harsh realities of the world. They shared stories they'd heard from friends of friends about female soldiers who supposedly couldn't handle the pressure, who broke down under stress, who were more liability than asset. I stood there, sauce-stained apron around my waist, listening to my neighbors tear apart everything I'd dedicated my life to. Every medal I'd earned, every life I'd saved, every sleepless night I'd spent planning operations that brought soldiers home alive. All of it dismissed as feminist propaganda and PC nonsense. The worst part wasn't their ignorance. It was their absolute certainty that they were right, their complete inability to consider that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have all the facts. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself retreating further into silence. What was the point of arguing? These people had made up their minds long before I'd moved to the neighborhood. Nothing I could say would change their fundamental belief that women were somehow lesser, that our contributions to the military were either exaggerated or non-existent. But silence, I was learning, has its own cost. Every dismissive comment, every condescending laugh, every casual erasure of women's service felt like a small betrayal of every female soldier I'd ever served alongside. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky when Brad made his final, most cutting comment of the day. You know what really bothers me about all this fake military woman stuff? He said, gesturing with his beer bottle. It dishonors the real heroes, the men who actually bled and died for this country. When you start pretending that everyone's a hero, the word loses all meaning. That's when I knew I was done pretending to be just another neighbor. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The words hung in the air like smoke from the grill. Real heroes, men who actually bled and died. The casual dismissal of everything I'd witnessed, everything I'd done, everything the women I'd served with had sacrificed, it hit me like a physical blow. I excused myself and walked toward the house, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. Through the kitchen window, I could see the group had already moved on to discussing neighborhood lawn care standards, Brad's voice carrying across the yard as he pontificated about proper fertilizer schedules. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Staff Sergeant Lisa Chen, one of my former squad leaders who was now stationed at Fort Richardson with me. Hey, Captain. Heard you moved to Maplewood Heights. Small world. My cousin lives there too. How's civilian life treating you? I stared at the message, then typed back, It's educational. Her response came quickly. Uh-oh. That sounds ominous. Everything okay? I found myself typing out the whole story. The neighbors, their comments, their absolute certainty that women like us were just pretending to be soldiers. Chen responded with a string of colorful emojis that would have made a drill sergeant proud. Want me to round up some of the girls and crash this party? She texted. We're all off duty today anyway. I almost said no. The rational part of my brain knew that proving a point to ignorant neighbors wasn't worth creating a scene. But then I heard Brad's booming laugh through the window, followed by Mike's voice saying something about snowflake participation trophies. You know what? I texted back. Maybe it's time they met some real soldiers. Chen's response was immediate. Say no more. Give me 20 minutes. I returned to the backyard, where the conversation had somehow circled back to military topics. This time, Carol was sharing a story she'd apparently heard on some talk radio show about female recruits who couldn't complete basic training. The standards have just gotten so watered down, she was saying, shaking her head sadly. They're so desperate to be politically correct that they're willing to compromise our national security. Exactly, Brad agreed, jabbing his spatula in the air for emphasis. It's not about being mean to women. It's about being realistic. Some jobs are just better suited for men, and that's okay. Why can't we just admit that? Jennifer nodded vigorously. It's like my yoga instructor always says. We need to embrace our differences instead of pretending they don't exist. Women are naturally more emotional, more nurturing. That's not a bad thing, it's just different. Right, Mike chimed in. And in a life-or-death situation, you want someone who's going to act on logic, not emotion. Someone who can make the hard choices without breaking down. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. In my 8 years of service, I'd made more hard choices than these people would face in a lifetime. I'd held dying soldiers in my arms and still managed to coordinate medevac helicopters. I'd watched friends get blown up by roadside bombs and continued leading missions the next day. But apparently in their minds, having ovaries automatically disqualified me from rational decision-making. Plus, Brad continued, warming to his theme, there's the physical reality. I'm not trying to be sexist, but the average woman just can't carry a wounded soldier to safety. It's basic biology. That almost broke my composure. During my second deployment, I'd carried Corporal Jake Morrison, all 180 pounds of him, nearly half a mile through enemy territory, after shrapnel tore through his leg. The scar on my shoulder from where his gear had dug in during that nightmare trek was still visible when one wore tank tops. I'm sure there are exceptions, Carol said diplomatically, but we can't make policy based on outliers. The needs of our fighting men have to come first. Fighting men, as if the women bleeding and dying beside them were somehow less worthy of consideration. My phone buzzed again. Chen, 5 minutes out. Should we come around front or through the back gate? I glanced toward the back gate, partially hidden behind Brad's prized rose bushes. Back gate, I typed. And Chen? Dress blues. Copy that, Captain. This is gonna be fun. The next few minutes crawled by like hours. Brad was now holding court about the, quote, old days, when military service meant something, when standards were high and political correctness hadn't ruined everything. Jennifer was nodding along, occasionally throwing in comments about how much she respected traditional values and the importance of maintaining military discipline. I just think it's a shame, she said, how they've turned the military into some kind of social experiment. These young women today have no idea what real service looks like. Absolutely, Mike agreed. They think showing up and following orders makes them heroes. They don't understand that real heroism requires sacrifice, requires putting others before yourself even when it's dangerous. I wondered what he'd think about the time I'd volunteered to stay behind with the wounded during a Taliban ambush, providing covering fire while the rest of my unit evacuated casualties to safety. Or about Sergeant Amanda Price, who'd thrown herself in front of an enemy grenade to protect a school full of Afghan children. But those stories didn't fit their narrative, so they'd probably find ways to dismiss them too. The sound of vehicles pulling up out front caught my attention, though the others were too absorbed in their conversation to notice. Car doors slammed in quick succession, more than one vehicle by the sound of it. The thing is, Brad was saying, gesturing expansively with his beer, real military heroes don't need to go around telling everyone about it. They do their duty quietly, without fanfare. All this modern stuff about celebrating every little accomplishment just cheapens the whole thing. Footsteps on the front walkway, multiple sets, moving with the precise cadence that only comes from years of drill and ceremony practice. Like my grandfather, Carol added. He was at D-Day, but he never talked about it. That generation understood that service was its own reward. They didn't need medals and recognition for every little thing they did. The footsteps had reached the backyard gate. I could hear quiet voices conferring just outside, Chen's voice and others I recognized. My heart started beating faster, not from nerves, but from something else entirely. Pride, maybe, or vindication. That's what I'm talking about, Mike said enthusiastically. Real soldiers, real heroes. Not like these modern publicity seekers who turn every deployment into a social media campaign. The gate latch clicked open. Don't get me wrong, Brad continued, oblivious to the sound. I'm sure some of these women mean well, but there's a difference between meaning well and actually being qualified for combat operations. You can't just lower the standards and pretend nothing's changed. Exactly, Jennifer agreed. It's not fair to the men who have to pick up the slack when these women can't handle the pressure. Quote, that's when 12 soldiers in pristine dress blue uniforms stepped through the gate in perfect formation. Staff Sergeant Chen led the group, her uniform immaculate, her bearing unmistakably military. Behind her came soldiers I'd served with across 3 different deployments, women who'd earned Purple Hearts, Bronze Stars, and commendations for valor under fire. Sergeant First Class Rebecca Torres, who'd single-handedly held off an enemy assault for 4 hours while waiting for reinforcement. Specialist Maria Gonzalez, who defused 17 IEDs during her tour in Iraq. Lieutenant Colonel Diana Hayes, whose tactical brilliance had saved hundreds of lives during the siege of Forward Operating Base Chapman. They moved with the fluid precision of soldiers who'd trained together, fought together, and earned each other's respect through shared hardship and sacrifice. Their ribbons and badges caught the afternoon sunlight, combat infantry badges, parachutist wings, Army Commendation Medals, and dozens of other decorations that told stories these neighbors couldn't even begin to imagine. The backyard fell silent, except for the sizzling of forgotten burgers on the grill. Chen stepped forward, her posture ramrod straight, and rendered a perfect salute. Captain Mitchell, she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of a career soldier. Staff Sergeant Chen reporting as requested, ma'am. The other soldiers snapped to attention behind her, their salutes sharp and synchronized. Ma'am, they said in unison. I returned their salute, feeling something shift inside me. For the first time since moving to this neighborhood, I felt like myself again. At ease, I said quietly. The soldiers relaxed into parade rest, but their presence filled the backyard with an energy that hadn't been there moments before. These weren't the fictional characters from Brad's dismissive stories. These were real women, real soldiers, Real heroes who'd earned their place through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Brad's mouth was hanging open, his spatula frozen halfway to the grill. Jennifer's wine glass had stopped halfway to her lips. Mike was staring like he'd seen a ghost, and Carol looked like she was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "Captain?" Chen asked, her voice carrying just the right amount of professional curiosity. "Is there anything you need us to address while we're here?" Quote, "I looked around at my neighbors, the same people who'd spent the afternoon explaining to me why women couldn't be real soldiers, why our service was just political theater, why we were pretending to be something we weren't. Actually," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I think there might be." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Brad's spatula finally completed its journey to the grill, but his movements were mechanical, like someone sleepwalking through familiar motions. The forgotten burgers began to char, sending up thin wisps of smoke that seemed to underscore the surreal nature of the moment. Jennifer was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sarah? What? Who are these people?" I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of command settle back onto them like a familiar coat. For 3 hours I'd been playing the role of the confused civilian neighbor, letting them mansplain military service to me while I bit my tongue. But that performance was over now. "These people," I said, my voice taking on the crisp authority I'd learned to project over the chaos of combat zones, "are my soldiers. Staff Sergeant Chen, would you mind introducing the team?" Chen stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd earned her stripes through years of exemplary service. "Certainly, Captain. To my left, we have Lieutenant Colonel Diana Hayes, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross for actions during the siege of Fob Chapman." Diana stepped forward slightly, her bearing unmistakably that of a senior officer. The silver oak leaves on her collar caught the light, but it was the ribbon rack on her chest that told the real story. Row upon row of decorations that spoke of multiple deployments, heroic actions, and unwavering dedication to duty. Behind her, Sergeant First Class Rebecca Torres, Combat Infantry Badge, Purple Heart, and Bronze Star with Valor for single-handedly repelling an enemy assault on Combat Outpost Phoenix. Rebecca's dark eyes swept across the group of neighbors with the measured gaze of someone who'd seen real danger and emerged victorious. The Combat Infantry Badge on her uniform, the one Brad had just finished explaining women couldn't earn, seemed to glint with quiet authority. Next to her, Specialist Maria Gonzalez, Explosive Ordnance Disposal Specialist with 17 confirmed IED neutralizations and a Bronze Star for actions under fire. Quote, "Maria's slight frame belied the incredible courage it took to walk toward bombs while others ran away. The EOD badge on her uniform marked her as part of one of the military's most elite and dangerous specialties." Chen continued down the line, each introduction more devastating to my neighbor's preconceptions than the last. Staff Sergeant Patricia Williams, who'd led a convoy through a Taliban ambush and brought every soldier home alive. Sergeant Jennifer Park, whose marksmanship skills had earned her a spot on the Army's competitive shooting team between deployments. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, a helicopter pilot who'd flown countless medevac missions under enemy fire. With each name, each accomplishment, each decoration, I watched my neighbors' faces change. The smug certainty that had characterized their entire afternoon was crumbling, replaced by something between confusion and dawning horror at what they'd been saying. And finally, Chen concluded, Master Sergeant Angela Foster, who served 3 tours as a combat medic and saved more lives than we can count, including mine during the ambush at Kandahar. Angela stepped forward, her medical insignia visible on her collar. She was the one who taught me how to apply tourniquets under fire, how to keep wounded soldiers alive when the nearest hospital was hours away by helicopter. She'd earned her rank through a combination of medical expertise and battlefield courage that would put most action movie heroes to shame. Brad finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and uncertain. I don't understand. Sarah, you said you worked in logistics." "I do work in logistics," I replied evenly. "I coordinate supply chains, personnel movements, and operational planning for the 342nd Infantry Battalion." I also hold a master's degree in strategic studies and speak 3 languages fluently, which comes in handy when coordinating with allied forces. Mike was shaking his head like he could somehow reset the conversation. But you never said, you let us think. I let you think what, exactly? I asked, my voice carrying the edge I'd perfected during countless briefings with skeptical male officers. I let you think I was just another civilian neighbor? I am. I let you think women couldn't serve in combat roles? That was your assumption, not my deception. Quote. Carol was staring at the ribbons and badges displayed across 12 uniforms, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with the worldview she'd been spouting all afternoon. But the things we said were incredibly insulting, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes interjected, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the highest-ranking person in the room. To Captain Mitchell, to every woman in uniform, and to the memory of those who didn't make it home. The weight of that statement settled over the backyard like a physical presence. These weren't theoretical soldiers from news reports or political debates. These were real women who'd put their lives on the line, who'd watched friends die, who'd carried the physical and emotional scars of combat. Jennifer's wine glass trembled in her hands. We didn't know, she whispered. No, Sergeant First Class Torres said, her voice flat and uncompromising. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. It was easier to dismiss us as political theater than to acknowledge that women have been fighting and dying for this country for decades. The Army has been fully integrated for years, Captain Rodriguez added. Women serve in every combat role, from infantry to special operations. We've been earning the same decorations, taking the same risks, making the same sacrifices as our male counterparts. Brad attempted to salvage something from the wreckage of his afternoon. Look, I'm sure you're all very brave, but the physical requirements are the same for everyone, Master Sergeant Foster cut him off. Same fitness standards, same training requirements, same performance expectations. No separate standards, no special accommodations. We earned our positions the same way every soldier does, through competence, dedication, and proven performance under pressure. The burgers on the grill were now sending up steady streams of black smoke, but nobody seemed to notice. The entire focus of the backyard had shifted to this confrontation between reality and prejudice. I carried a wounded soldier 3 miles through enemy territory, Specialist Gonzalez said quietly. He weighed 40 pounds more than me, but he was my teammate, and leaving him wasn't an option. Physical strength isn't just about muscle mass, it's about will, determination, and training. Quote, I've performed emergency surgery in the back of a moving Humvee while taking small arms fire, Master Sergeant Foster added. Steady hands and clear thinking under pressure aren't determined by gender. Mike was still shaking his head, but his arguments were getting weaker. But statistically, men are stronger. Statistically, Staff Sergeant Williams interrupted, I can outshoot, outrun, and outthink most of the male soldiers in my unit. Statistics are averages, not individuals. Judge soldiers by their performance, not their gender. The conversation was becoming increasingly one-sided. Every argument my neighbors had made, every dismissive comment, every casual insult was being systematically dismantled by women who'd lived the reality they'd been denying. Chen stepped forward again, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering a briefing. Captain Mitchell has served 8 years of active duty, including 5 combat deployments across Afghanistan and Iraq. She's earned 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Army Commendation Medals, and a Purple Heart. She's led convoy operations, coordinated air support for ground troops, and saved more lives than most people will ever know about. She paused, letting that information sink in. While you were discussing lawn fertilizer and neighborhood gossip, she was making life and death decisions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. While you were complaining about political correctness, she was proving her worth under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The backyard had gone completely quiet, except for the sound of a smoke alarm starting to beep inside Brad's house. Apparently the smoke from the ruined burgers had finally reached the kitchen detector. I think, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said with the diplomatic tone of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations, this would be a good time for some reflection on the assumptions we make about people we don't really know. Carol finally spoke, her voice small and uncertain. Sarah, we had no idea. The things we said were based on ignorance and prejudice, I finished for her. The same ignorance and prejudice that women in the military face every day, from people who think they know better without having any actual knowledge or experience. The smoke alarm was getting louder, its insistent beeping adding an almost comedic soundtrack to the heavy atmosphere in the backyard. Perhaps, Chen suggested with just a hint of amusement in her voice, we should deal with that fire hazard before continuing this conversation? Brad jolted as if waking from a dream, rushing to flip the charred remains of what had once been hamburgers. But the damage was done, both to the food and to his credibility. The smoke alarm's relentless beeping filled the awkward silence as Brad scraped charred meat off the grill grates, his movements jerky and unfocused. The acrid smell of burned beef mixed with the lingering tension in the air, creating an atmosphere that felt almost apocalyptic. Turn off that damn alarm, he shouted toward the house, his voice cracking with stress. Jennifer hurried inside, her high heels clicking rapidly across the deck, grateful for any excuse to escape the confrontation. When the beeping finally stopped, the quiet that followed felt even more oppressive. 12 soldiers stood at ease, their presence transforming Brad's backyard from a casual neighborhood gathering into something resembling a military tribunal. Look, Mike finally said, his voice defensive but noticeably smaller than it had been earlier. Maybe we got a little carried away with our opinions, but you have to understand, we hear stories on the news, see things online. You hear propaganda, Sergeant First Class Torres interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuse like a blade. Carefully crafted narratives designed to make people like you feel justified in your prejudices. You don't seek out real information because it might challenge what you want to believe. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stepped forward, her officers bearing commanding attention even in civilian surroundings. Mike, isn't it? Tell me, what's your professional background? Mike shifted uncomfortably. I'm insured, auto insurance mostly. I see. And if I started lecturing you about actuarial tables and risk assessment, based on something I saw in a movie, how would that make you feel? The analogy hit home with brutal effectiveness. Mike's face reddened, but he had no response. Carol, meanwhile, was staring at Master Sergeant Foster with undisguised fascination. The medical training you mentioned, how extensive is that exactly? Foster's expression remained professional, but I caught a flicker of something that might have been approved of the genuine question. I'm a fully certified emergency medical technician with additional combat trauma training. I can perform field surgery, manage complex injuries, and coordinate medical evacuations under fire. My training is equivalent to what civilian trauma surgeons receive, plus specialized battlefield medicine. She saved my life, Staff Sergeant Park added quietly. Took shrapnel in 3 places during a mortar attack on our forward operating base. Angela worked on me for 47 minutes while the base was still under fire, refusing to move to safety until I was stable enough for transport. The raw honesty of that statement seemed to cut through the last of Carol's defenses. Her eyes filled with tears as the reality of what these women had experienced finally began to penetrate her consciousness. We owe you an apology, she whispered. All of you, the things we said were inexcusable. Apologies are a start, Captain Rodriguez said, her pilot's precision evident even in conversation. But understanding is more important. You spent 3 hours today casually dismissing the service and sacrifice of thousands of women based on nothing more than your own assumptions. Jennifer returned from the house, having clearly taken extra time to compose herself. Her makeup was slightly smudged, suggesting she'd been crying in the kitchen. I Googled some of the decorations you mentioned, she said, her voice barely audible. The Distinguished Service Cross, the Bronze Star with Valor. I had no idea what they meant. Most civilians don't, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes replied, not unkindly. But that's precisely why making sweeping statements about military service is so problematic. You're discussing life and death situations, acts of extraordinary courage, and complex tactical operations, as if they were topics for casual debate. Brad had given up on salvaging the burgers, and was now standing with his hands at his sides, looking lost in his own backyard. Sarah, he said finally, why didn't you just tell us? If we'd known you were really in the military. Would that have changed your fundamental beliefs about women's capabilities? I asked. Or would you have just made an exception for me while continuing to dismiss every other woman in uniform? The question hung in the air, unanswered but clearly hitting its mark. Specialist Gonzalez spoke up, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating obvious truths. The problem isn't that you didn't know Captain Mitchell's background. The problem is that you felt qualified to make definitive statements about subjects you know nothing about. You turned military service into a gender debate instead of recognizing it for what it is, a profession that demands excellence regardless of who's performing it. But the physical differences are real, Mike protested weakly, clinging to his last argument. Men are generally stronger, faster. And women are generally more accurate marksmen, better at multitasking under stress, and have higher pain tolerance, Staff Sergeant Williams countered. Physical differences exist, but they don't determine combat effectiveness. Modern warfare isn't about who can bench press the most weight. It's about intelligence, adaptability, technical skill, and the ability to make split-second decisions under pressure. Chen nodded in agreement. I've served alongside male soldiers who couldn't handle the psychological stress of combat, and female soldiers who thrived in the most dangerous situations imaginable. Courage, competence, and dedication aren't determined by chromosomes. The conversation was beginning to shift from confrontation to education, though the underlying tension remained. My neighbors were finally listening instead of just waiting for their turn to speak. The women who serve alongside us aren't there because of lowered standards or political correctness, Master Sergeant Foster explained. They're there because they've proven themselves capable of doing one of the world's most demanding jobs. Every one of us has earned our place through performance, not politics. Think about it logically, Captain Rodriguez added. Do you really think the military, an institution built on effectiveness and survival, would compromise its mission for the sake of social experimentation? Combat units don't have room for passengers. Everyone has to pull their weight, or people die. The simple logic of that statement seemed to resonate with Brad's business-oriented mind. I guess I never thought about it that way. Most people don't, I said, speaking directly to him for the first time since the confrontation began. It's easier to rely on stereotypes and assumptions than to confront the complexity of reality. But when you dismiss women's military service, you're not just insulting us. You're dishonoring every sacrifice made by female service members throughout history. Jennifer wiped her eyes with a napkin. We really messed up, didn't we? Quote. You did, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes confirmed, but her tone was more instructional than accusatory. But recognition of error is the first step toward growth. The question now is what you do with this knowledge. What do you mean? Carol asked. I mean, Hayes continued, that ignorance is only excusable until the moment you're confronted with truth. From this point forward, you have a responsibility to do better, to think before you speak, to educate yourselves before forming opinions, to recognize that your assumptions might be wrong. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower, casting long shadows across the backyard. The party that had started as a typical neighborhood barbecue had transformed into something none of us could have anticipated. There's something else you need to understand, Chen said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. When you make jokes about women's military service, when you dismiss our contributions as propaganda or political theater, you're not just talking about strangers. You're talking about daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. You're talking about women who've made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. She paused, her composure faltering slightly for the first time. I lost my best friend, Corporal Jessica Martinez, to an IED in Helmand Province. She was 23 years old, had a degree in engineering, and could outshoot every man in her platoon. She died protecting a convoy of school supplies bound for Afghan children. When you say women aren't real soldiers, you're spitting on her grave. The raw emotion in Chen's voice hit the group like a physical blow. Even Mike, who'd been the most argumentative, looked genuinely stricken. We didn't know, he whispered. No, I said, my own voice carrying years of accumulated frustration and grief. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. Because it was more comfortable to maintain your preconceptions than to acknowledge the reality of women's military service. The backyard fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different, less confrontational, more contemplative. Something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between us. Carol was the first to break the silence. "What can we do? How do we make this right?" "You start," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said, "by never making assumptions about someone's capabilities based on their gender again. You educate yourselves about military service instead of relying on stereotypes and secondhand opinions. And you remember this conversation the next time you're tempted to dismiss someone's experiences without bothering to learn the facts. And maybe," Master Sergeant Foster added with a slight smile, "you learn to ask better questions. Instead of assuming what someone can or can't do, ask about their actual experiences. You might be surprised by what you learn." The transformation in the backyard's atmosphere was remarkable. What had begun as a confrontation was evolving into something that looked almost like understanding. As the late afternoon sun painted the backyard in golden hues, something remarkable began to happen. The rigid formation of soldiers gradually relaxed, and what had started as a military tribunal was slowly transforming into an actual conversation. Staff Sergeant Park had begun talking with Carol about her grandmother, who had served as a nurse in Vietnam. "She never talked about it much," Carol was saying, her voice thoughtful. "But I remember finding her medals in a shoebox after she passed. I didn't realize they gave Purple Hearts to nurses. They give them to anyone wounded in service to their country," Park replied gently. "Your grandmother probably saw things, experienced things, that she could never adequately explain to people who weren't there. That's common among veterans, especially women whose service gets overlooked or minimized." Meanwhile, Mike had cornered Specialist Gonzalez, his insurance agent's mind clearly struggling to process the concept of voluntarily walking toward explosive devices. "How do you psychologically prepare for that? For bomb disposal, I mean." "Training helps," Gonzalez replied, seeming almost amused by his genuine curiosity. "But mostly you focus on the mission. Every IED defuse means soldiers go home alive, means civilian families don't get torn apart. When the stakes are that clear, fear becomes secondary to purpose." Brad was in conversation with Master Sergeant Foster, asking detailed questions about field medicine that revealed he was finally beginning to grasp the complexity and skill required for battlefield operations. "So when you say emergency surgery," he said, "you mean actual surgery? Like life-or-death procedures?" "Last year, I performed an emergency cricothyrotomy on a soldier whose airway was blocked by shrapnel," Foster explained matter-of-factly. "Essentially, I cut a hole in his throat so he could breathe while we waited for medevac. The entire procedure took place in the back of a moving vehicle while we were taking intermittent small arms fire." Brad's face had gone pale. "And that's routine?" "It's the job," Foster replied simply. "When someone's life is on the line, you do whatever needs to be done. Gender doesn't enter into the equation." Jennifer had approached Lieutenant Colonel Hayes with the kind of deference she might show to a CEO or federal judge. "Ma'am, can I ask how you got started in the military? I mean, was it always your plan to make it a career?" Hayes smiled, the expression transforming her stern features. "I joined right out of college because I wanted to serve my country and pay for graduate school. I stayed because I discovered I was good at it, and because the work mattered. 22 years later, I'm responsible for strategic planning at the Pentagon. It's been an incredible journey." "The Pentagon?" Jennifer's eyes widened. "Like the actual Pentagon? In Washington?" "The actual Pentagon," Hayes confirmed. "I brief senior military leadership on global security issues. Last month, I presented a strategic assessment to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Next week, I'm flying to Brussels to coordinate with NATO allies on Eastern European defense planning." The revelation seemed to short-circuit Jennifer's remaining preconceptions. Here was a woman discussing international military strategy, while Jennifer had spent the afternoon questioning whether women could handle combat stress. "I found myself talking with Captain Rodriguez about the technical aspects of helicopter operations in combat zones. The hardest part isn't the flying," she was explaining. "It's the split-second decisions about whether a landing zone is secure enough to risk your crew and aircraft. You're calculating wind patterns, enemy positions, terrain obstacles, and casualty priorities all simultaneously while potentially taking fire. How do you train for something like that? I asked, genuinely curious about her specialty, despite my own military background. Thousands of hours of simulation, then real-world experience that you pray you never need but are grateful to have when lives depend on it, she replied. Every pilot, male or female, goes through identical training. The aircraft doesn't care about the gender of who's flying it, only about competence and decision-making under pressure. Quote, Chen was sharing stories with the group about our time together in Afghanistan, carefully avoiding operational details while painting a picture of the daily realities of deployment life. People think combat zones are all firefights and explosions, she was saying, but most of the work is logistics, coordination, and relationship building with local populations. You need cultural sensitivity, language skills, and diplomatic finesse as much as tactical training. Sarah was incredible at that, she continued, catching my eye across the group. She could negotiate with village elders in the morning, coordinate air support in the afternoon, and plan supply routes at night. The soldiers under her command trusted her completely because she'd proven her competence in every aspect of military operations. The praise made me uncomfortable, but I could see its effect on my neighbors. They were beginning to understand that military leadership required far more than the simplistic stereotypes they'd been operating under. As the conversation continued, other neighbors began appearing at the fence line, drawn by curiosity about the uniformed soldiers in Brad's backyard. Mrs. Patterson from next door peered over the fence with undisguised interest, while the Johnson family from across the street found excuses to check their mailbox multiple times. Looks like we're drawing an audience, Sergeant Williams observed with amusement. Let them look, Chen replied with a grin. Maybe it'll give them something to think about, too. The comment prompted a discussion about public perception of military service and the disconnect between civilian assumptions and military reality. Part of the problem, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes explained, is that most Americans have no direct connection to the military anymore. Less than 1% of the population serves, so the majority of people form their opinions based on movies, television, and political rhetoric rather than actual knowledge. That's why conversations like this matter, Master Sergeant Foster added. When people meet real soldiers, talk to them as individuals rather than stereotypes, it humanizes military service in a way that media representations never can. Brad, who had been increasingly quiet as the afternoon progressed, finally spoke up with obvious difficulty. I owe all of you an apology. Not just for today, but for years of thinking I understood something I clearly knew nothing about. The things I said were ignorant and hurtful, and I'm ashamed of myself. His admission seemed to open floodgates. Jennifer followed with her own apology, tears streaming down her face as she acknowledged how wrong she'd been. Mike talked about his own insecurities and how he'd used military stereotypes to feel better about his own choices not to serve. Carol spoke about her regret at not asking her grandmother more about her wartime experiences while she was still alive. Apologies are important, I said finally, but actions matter more. The question is what you do with this knowledge going forward. What do you mean? Brad asked. I mean that ignorance is only forgivable once, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes interjected. Now that you know better, you have a responsibility to do better, to educate yourselves, to speak up when you hear others making the same mistakes you made today. Chen nodded in agreement. The next time someone makes dismissive comments about women in the military, you can share what you learned today. You can be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. There are practical things you can do too, Captain Rodriguez suggested. Support veteran organizations that serve all veterans, not just male ones. Learn about military history that includes women's contributions. Stop making assumptions about people's capabilities based on their gender. And maybe, Specialist Gonzalez added with a slight smile, learn to ask better questions. Instead of assuming what someone can or can't do, ask about their actual experiences. You might be surprised by what you discover. The afternoon was winding down, but the conversation showed no signs of stopping. My neighbors were asking increasingly sophisticated questions about military structure, deployment rotations, and the transition back to civilian life. They wanted to understand not just what we did, but why we did it and what it meant to us personally. I have to ask, Jennifer said hesitantly, What made you want to keep your service secret? Why not just tell us from the beginning? I considered the question carefully before answering, because I wanted to be judged as a person, not as a symbol or a political statement. I wanted to see who you really were when you thought you were safe to express your honest opinions. And honestly, I was tired of having to prove my worth to people who'd already made up their minds. But you did prove it, Carol said quietly, in the most dramatic way possible. I shouldn't have had to, I replied. That's the point. My worth as a neighbor, as a person, as a professional, shouldn't depend on my willingness to display my military credentials. Just like your worth doesn't depend on proving your competence in insurance or yoga instruction or garden maintenance. The simple truth of that statement seemed to resonate deeply with the group. They were beginning to understand that their dismissive attitudes weren't just about military service, they were about fundamental respect for other people's experiences and capabilities. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, 12 soldiers began preparing to leave. They'd accomplished far more than I'd ever expected when I'd texted Chen in frustration hours earlier. The soldiers moved with the same precision they'd displayed upon arrival, gathering into formation as shadows lengthened across the backyard. But something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere. Where there had been confrontation and tension hours earlier, there was now something approaching mutual respect. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stepped forward to address the group of neighbors, her authoritative presence commanding attention one final time. Before we leave, I want to share something that might help you understand the broader significance of today's conversation. She paused, ensuring she had everyone's focus. Every Memorial Day, military families across the country gather to remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice. We honor fathers, brothers, husbands, sons, but we also honor mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters. Women who died serving their country, whose stories often go untold because people assume their service was somehow less significant. Carol dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. We never thought about it that way. Most civilians don't, Hayes replied. But when you dismiss women's military contributions, you're not just insulting the living, you're dishonoring the dead. You're telling the families of fallen female service members that their loved ones' sacrifices don't count. The weight of that statement settled over the group like a physical presence. Brad, who had been mostly silent since his earlier apologies, finally found his voice again. Colonel Hayes, is there something we should be doing, some way to honor those sacrifices properly? Quote. Hayes exchanged glances with me, and I could see a flicker of approval in her expression. Education is the best tribute you can offer. Learn their names, their stories, their contributions. Stop perpetuating myths about women's capabilities and start acknowledging their achievements. Chen stepped forward, pulling out her phone. There's a memorial wall at the Women in Military Service for America Museum in Arlington. It lists thousands of women who served with distinction throughout history. Many of their stories would surprise you. I'd like to visit that, Jennifer said quietly. Maybe we all should. That's a start, Master Sergeant Foster agreed. But the real change happens in everyday interactions. The next time someone makes dismissive comments about women in any profession, military, civilian, it doesn't matter. Remember today. Remember that competence isn't determined by gender. Specialist Gonzalez had been listening to the conversation with an expression of cautious optimism. What gives me hope, she said, is that you're asking these questions now. You're willing to admit you were wrong and learn something new. That's more than a lot of people would do. The comment sparked a discussion about personal growth and the difficulty of changing long-held beliefs. Mike, surprisingly, became quite philosophical about the experience. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, he told Sergeant First Class Torres, about making assumptions based on movies and news reports. I do that with a lot of things, don't I? Not just military stuff. Torres nodded thoughtfully. We all do. It's human nature to categorize and generalize. It's how our brains process information efficiently. But the problems arise when we mistake those mental shortcuts for actual knowledge. The difference, Captain Rodriguez added, is being willing to update your understanding when presented with new information. Today, you were presented with new information. What you do with it going forward is what matters. Brad had been standing near his ruined grill, looking lost in thought. "You know what bothers me most about today?" he said finally. "It's not just that I was wrong about military service. It's that I was so confident in being wrong. I never questioned my assumptions, never wondered if maybe I didn't have the full picture." "That's actually a valuable realization," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes observed. "Intellectual humility, the recognition that we might not know as much as we think we do, is one of the most important qualities a person can develop." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Patterson from next door, who had apparently worked up the courage to approach the fence directly. "Excuse me," she called out tentatively, "but are you really all soldiers?" Staff Sergeant Williams grinned and walked over to the fence. "We are indeed. Would you like to hear about what we do?" What followed was a fascinating, impromptu education session, as Mrs. Patterson's questions drew out more stories from the soldiers. She was particularly interested in military engineering, having worked as a civil engineer before retirement, and was amazed to learn about the infrastructure projects military engineers completed in combat zones. "You built schools and hospitals while people were shooting at you?" she asked incredulously. "Construction doesn't stop for war," Staff Sergeant Park explained. "Communities need infrastructure to function, whether there's conflict happening or not. Military engineers often work under fire because the mission requirements don't pause for safety concerns." Other neighbors had begun gathering along the fence line, drawn by curiosity and the increasingly animated conversation. The Johnson family from across the street had brought their teenage daughter, who was considering military service as a way to pay for college. "What would you want to know?" Chen asked the girl directly. "Not what your parents want to know, not what you think you should ask. What do you actually want to understand about military service?" The questions sparked an honest discussion about military life, deployment challenges, career opportunities, and the realities of balancing service with personal goals. The teenagers' questions were sharp and practical, clearly coming from someone who'd done her research. "My guidance counselor said women can't get security clearances for the really important jobs," she said at one point. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes laughed outright. "Your guidance counselor is profoundly misinformed. I hold a top-secret clearance with special access programs. So do most of the women standing here. Security clearances are based on background investigations and personal reliability, not gender." "What kind of work do you do with that clearance?" the teenager pressed. "I develop strategic intelligence assessments for senior military leadership," Hayes replied. "I analyze global threats, coordinate with international allies, and help shape military policy at the highest levels. Gender has never been a factor in my clearance or my assignments." The teenager's eyes lit up with possibility. "That sounds incredible." "It is," Hayes confirmed. "It's also demanding, sometimes dangerous, and requires absolute dedication. But if you're willing to put in the work, the opportunities are limitless." As the informal gathering continued, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected turn the day had taken. What had started as a moment of personal frustration had evolved into something much larger, a genuine learning experience that seemed to be changing perspectives in real time. Chen approached me as the conversation continued around us. "Think this did any good?" she asked quietly. I looked around at my neighbors. Brad asking detailed questions about military logistics. Jennifer taking notes on her phone about veteran support organizations. Carol planning a visit to the Women's Military Museum. Mike discussing his assumptions about other topics he might be wrong about. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think it did." The sun was setting in earnest now, painting the sky in brilliant purples and golds. The soldiers began their final preparations to leave. But the mood felt more like the end of a successful community meeting than the conclusion of a confrontation. "Before you go," Brad said, his voice carrying genuine emotion, "I want you to know that this conversation changed something fundamental for me. Not just about military service, but about how I approach people and ideas I don't understand." "That's the best outcome we could have hoped for," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes replied. "The goal was never to humiliate anyone or win an argument. It was to bridge the gap between assumption and reality." Jennifer stepped forward, her earlier confidence replaced by genuine humility. "Sarah, I hope you can forgive us for today. And I hope you'll give us a chance to be better neighbors going forward." "Fresh starts are what neighborhoods are for," I replied, meaning it. "But remember, this conversation doesn't end when the uniforms leave. The real test is how you handle the next situation, where your assumptions are challenged. Quote, as the soldiers filed out through the back gate, each one stopping to shake hands with the neighbors they'd spent the afternoon educating, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope, not just for better relationships with my neighbors, but for the possibility that meaningful change could happen through honest conversation and mutual respect. The backyard felt strangely empty after they left, the silence filled with the weight of everything that had been said and learned. Brad stood among the ruins of his Memorial Day barbecue. Charred burgers, cold sides, forgotten decorations. But somehow the wreckage felt less like failure and more like transformation. Well, he said finally, looking around at the aftermath, this was definitely not the barbecue I planned. No, I agreed, untying my sauce-stained apron at last. But it might have been exactly the barbecue we needed. As I walked back to my house that evening, I realized that for the first time since moving to Maplewood Heights, I felt like I truly belonged in the neighborhood. Not because I'd hidden who I was, and not because I'd proven my worth through a dramatic reveal, but because my neighbors had finally taken the time to see me, really see me, as a complete person. The next morning, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox from Carol, along with a small American flag and a card that read, "Thank you for your service and for your patience." It was a small gesture, but it represented something much larger, the beginning of genuine understanding and respect. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil or in dramatic circumstances. Sometimes they're fought in suburban backyards, over burned hamburgers and wounded pride, where the weapons are words and the victory is measured not in territory gained but in minds changed. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you discover that your neighbors are capable of growth, that assumptions can be challenged, and that respect can be earned through patience and truth rather than confrontation and anger. The barbecue was over, but the real work of building community was just beginning. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.